The morning sky over Rome was heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves were mourning. Bells rang across the city, their deep tones echoing through narrow streets, carrying the message that this was not an ordinary day. It was the funeral of Pope Francis, a moment that drew millions of eyes from every corner of the world. Pilgrims, leaders, and ordinary people had come together to witness history. St. Peter's Square was already filled long before dawn, and the crowd grew thicker as time moved closer to the ceremony. Inside the square, silence rested like a blanket, broken only by the sound of prayers whispered by those waiting. The Swiss guards stood at their posts, dressed in their ancient uniforms of blue, red, and yellow. Their halberds gleamed, and their polished armor reflected the pale light. These men were more than ceremonial figures. They were symbols of loyalty and discipline, bound by centuries of tradition to protect the papacy. Among them stood a young guard named Matteo Rossi. He had joined the guard 5 years earlier, driven by his devotion to the church and his admiration for the Pope. Today, however, his heart was heavier than ever before. Matteo was not supposed to feel. He was trained to be still, to be silent, to let the world pass by without reaction. A Swiss guard on duty was like a statue, alive yet motionless. But as he stood near the center of the great square, his eyes followed the long white coffin that held the man who had shaped his faith. Pope Francis had been more than just a leader of the church. He had been a humble shepherd, a fatherly figure who embraced the poor, welcomed the outcast, and reminded everyone of the power of kindness. Matteo had seen this not only from a distance but also in private moments. The Pope had often spoken personally to the guards, not treating them as faceless protectors but as men with stories, dreams, and struggles. Matteo remembered a time when he had nearly left the guard. The long hours, the strict rules, and the weight of responsibility had been too much for him. He had felt small and unworthy. It was Pope Francis who noticed his troubled face one morning and invited him for a short conversation. "You must serve with love, not fear," the Pope had told him gently. "If you stand here only because of rules, your heart will grow tired. But if you stand here because you love what you guard, then even your weariness will carry meaning." Those words had stayed with Matteo. They had turned his doubt into devotion. Now, standing among his fellow guards, he carried those words in his soul like a flame. The ceremony began with solemn chants. The choir's voices rose pure and steady, filling the vast square with music that touched the heart of every listener. Cardinals, dressed in red, moved with careful dignity. Bishops bowed their heads. Heads of state sat in silence, their presence a reminder of how the Pope had touched not only the church but also the world. Even the air seemed still, as if the entire universe had paused to honor the man whose life had been dedicated to peace. Matteo tried to focus on his duty. His hands gripped the halberd tightly, his back straight, his face expressionless. Yet behind that mask of discipline, his thoughts churned. He could see the coffin moving slowly forward, carried by men in white. His eyes blurred for a moment, and he had to force himself not to blink too much. Tears had no place in a soldier's eyes, especially here. Still, the emotions pressed against him like waves against stone. He thought of the Pope's smile, the way he would bend slightly when speaking to children, the warmth in his voice when he spoke of forgiveness. He remembered seeing him pause to bless a homeless man at the edge of the square one evening, when others had walked past without notice. He remembered how the Pope had insisted that every person, no matter how forgotten, mattered. These were not gestures for cameras or speeches for applause. They were truths lived out in the simplest of ways. Matteo felt as though he had not just lost a leader, but someone who had made him believe in goodness again. The crowd was so vast that the sea of faces stretched beyond what Matteo could see. Yet even in such size, silence ruled. It was the silence of grief, the silence of respect. Only the steady voices of the priests rose above, reciting ancient prayers in Latin, words that had been spoken for centuries. Matteo knew those prayers by heart, yet today they struck him differently. They were not just rituals. They were farewells. He noticed his fellow guards. They stood still like tall columns of strength, their eyes forward, their posture flawless. They had all been trained for this, prepared to keep their emotions locked away. But Matteo's chest felt tighter with every passing minute. He knew he should be like them, calm, unwavering, detached. But his heart refused to obey. The memory of the Pope's kindness kept pressing through the walls of his discipline. The words "serve with love, not fear" echoed again and again. The coffin reached its place at the center of the square. Flowers surrounded it, White lilies and roses laid carefully in honor. The air was heavy with incense, smoke curling upward into the gray sky. The scent was sharp yet strangely comforting. It reminded Matteo of the many masses he had attended, the countless times he had stood guard in the basilica, watching as pilgrims knelt in awe. This time, however, it was different. This time it felt like a chapter was closing forever. Matteo shifted slightly on his feet. The movement was almost invisible, but to him it felt like a storm. He tried to steady himself, forcing his body back into stillness. Yet the storm inside grew stronger. He wanted to pray, but the rules forbade any speech or whisper. He wanted to step closer, to show respect in a way that went beyond standing like stone, but that too was forbidden. The Swiss Guard did not move once they were in position. They were symbols of unbroken order. Any deviation was considered failure. Still, Matteo's heart pounded. His eyes fell on the coffin once more and his breath caught. This was the last time he would see the Pope he admired, the man who had once lifted his spirit with a few kind words. Could he really just stand there silent and cold, pretending he was nothing more than a statue? The thought burned in him. He clenched his jaw, fighting against it. Duty, he told himself. Discipline. Honor. But another voice inside whispered back. Love. Gratitude. Truth. The bells tolled again, deep and resonant, marking another stage of the ceremony. The sound rolled through the square, and in that moment Matteo felt as if the world was holding its breath. He stared at the coffin, his vision trembling as his eyes blurred again. His hand tightened around the halberd, so much so that his knuckles turned white. The young guard tried to draw strength from tradition, but instead he felt it slipping away. His heart was stronger than the rules he had been trained to follow. The voices of the choir swelled, their song rising higher, almost angelic. The words spoke of eternal rest, of peace beyond the grave. Matteo's lips parted slightly. A prayer formed in his mind, unspoken but powerful. His eyes closed for the briefest second, and he whispered it silently within his heart. Thank you. It was the only prayer he could manage, but it was enough to fill him with a strange courage. As he opened his eyes, he realized something was happening within him that he could no longer control. The ceremony was not just a ritual, it was personal. He had been told to bury his feelings, but the weight of his gratitude refused to be buried. Every second felt longer, every moment heavier. The world was watching, yet in his heart, only one person mattered, the man in the coffin. The Pope who had shown him what it meant to serve with love. And though Matteo remained still, he knew that something was breaking inside the wall of discipline. Something was moving toward a choice that would shock not only the Vatican, but the entire world. The funeral ceremony moved forward with a calm rhythm, each prayer carefully spoken, each hymn carried on the wind. The square was full, yet it felt almost timeless. People from every corner of the world stood together, their differences forgotten for a moment of unity. All eyes were fixed on the white coffin of Pope Francis, lying in a place of honor, surrounded by cardinals in red and bishops in white. The sound of the choir echoed against the stone walls of St. Peter's Basilica, lifting the sorrow of the crowd into the sky. Matteo Rossi, the young Swiss guard, stood at his post with his fellow guards. His back was straight, his hands gripped the halberd, and his face looked calm. But inside, his heart was restless. He had trained for years to master stillness, yet today it felt impossible. The presence of the coffin before him was not just a symbol of loss, it was a reminder of the man he had known. The man who had spoken words that had changed his life forever. He remembered again that quiet morning in the Vatican gardens. He had been troubled, close to giving up his service. Pope Francis had walked slowly, accompanied by only one priest. When he saw Matteo's downcast face, the Pope stopped and asked what was wrong. At first, Matteo tried to deny his feelings, but the Pope's gentle eyes encouraged honesty. "I don't know if I belong here," Matteo had admitted. The Pope placed his hand on his shoulder and said words Matteo could never forget. "You are here not because of perfection, but because of love. Love makes us strong. Love gives meaning to service." That memory burned inside him now while the world bowed in silence. He wanted to honor the Pope not just with his duty, but with his heart. Yet the strict code of the Swiss Guard allowed no room for personal expression during such a sacred ritual. They were to remain immovable, symbols of discipline. Any movement, any sign of emotion, would be considered breaking protocol. As the cardinals began to chant a long prayer, Matteo's eyes focused on the coffin. He could see the golden papal seal shining faintly against the white surface. His vision blurred slightly and he blinked quickly to clear it. He told himself to stay strong, but no command could silence the storm of emotions rising in him. The prayer continued, the Latin words heavy and ancient, and Matteo felt his chest tighten. He wanted to whisper his own prayer, something simple from his heart, but he knew he was not supposed to speak. The rules were clear, absolute silence. His lips pressed together, but his soul felt trapped. He could almost hear the Pope's voice in his memory saying, "Love is greater than rules." His grip on the halberd tightened until his fingers ached. He tried to hold on to his training, to the voice of discipline, but it was slipping away. He wanted to do something, anything that showed the depth of his gratitude. His mind raced. The other guards beside him looked like statues, their expressions fixed and cold. He admired them, but at the same time he felt distant. His heart was not cold. His heart was alive, beating with memories and grief. A gentle breeze moved through the square, carrying the scent of incense. The smoke curled upward, dancing in the air, and Matteo felt tears pressing against his eyes again. He fought them back, forcing himself to blink them away. But he could no longer deny the truth. Standing motionless was tearing him apart. He needed to act not out of rebellion, but out of love. Then it happened. His lips parted, and in a voice so low that only he could hear, he whispered a short prayer. "Thank you, Holy Father." The words were carried away instantly by the wind, but to him they felt powerful. His heart steadied for a moment, relieved that he had at least spoken what he carried inside. But it did not end there. As the choir sang a hymn of farewell, his body moved without thought. His right foot stepped forward, only a single step, but enough to break the perfect line of the guard. The sound of his boot on the stone echoed softly in his ears, and his breath caught. He realized instantly what he had done. He had broken protocol. Gasps rippled from nearby onlookers. It was a small movement, but in a place where silence and order ruled, it was like thunder. Some people in the crowd turned their heads, whispering in confusion. Cameras, always searching for detail, caught the motion and zoomed in. Across the world, millions watching live saw it. A Swiss guard stepping out of formation at the funeral of Pope Francis. Matteo's heart pounded. He knew he had crossed a line. Every instinct in his training told him to step back, to return to his position before the mistake grew worse. But his heart refused. Instead, his knees bent, and slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee in front of the coffin. His head bowed deeply, his halberd resting lightly against his shoulder. The square fell into even deeper silence. For a moment it seemed the entire Vatican froze. Cardinals turned their eyes toward him. Bishops exchanged glances. Vatican officials shifted uncomfortably. No one moved to stop him, yet the weight of tradition pressed heavy in the air. Matteo whispered again, his voice trembling but clear enough to those near him. "Thank you for teaching us love. Thank you for teaching us faith." His words were not rehearsed. They flowed from his heart, honest and raw. The reaction of the crowd was mixed at first. Some gasped in shock, expecting the young guard to be dragged away. Others felt a wave of emotion stir inside them. Whispers spread quickly. "Did you see that?" He kneeled. A guard kneeled. The cameras broadcasted every second the image of Matteo kneeling before the Pope's coffin, becoming the focus of the world. His fellow guards did not move. They stood like stone, but Matteo could sense the tension between them. He knew they must have been shocked. Yet none of them reached out to stop him. He was alone in his act, yet not abandoned. Inside, Matteo's heart calmed for the first time that day. He no longer felt torn between duty and love. For him, this was both. This was his true duty. To honor not just the office of the Pope, but the man himself. And if it cost him his place in the guard, then so be it. The coffin lay silent, surrounded by flowers. Matteo's knee pressed against the cold stone, his head bowed in prayer. Around him, the world whispered and wondered, but inside he felt peace. He had broken protocol, yes, but he had not broken faith. In his heart, he believed the Pope himself would have smiled at his gesture. And as he stayed there for a few moments longer, the entire Vatican was left stunned. The square was silent, but it was not the silence of prayer anymore. It was the silence of shock. One man in bright colors had broken the ancient rhythm of the Vatican. Matteo Rossi, the young Swiss guard, knelt before the coffin of Pope Francis, his head bowed, his halberd lowered in a gesture that was never permitted. The cameras focused on him instantly, and the image flashed across television screens and phones around the globe. The people in the crowd held their breath. They had never seen such a thing before. The Swiss Guard were famous for their discipline, for their ability to stand like statues through long hours of ceremony, heat, or rain. For centuries they had been unshakable, their role unchanged, and yet here was one of them, breaking the line, moving forward, bending his knee in front of the coffin of the Pope. Some whispered in confusion. "What is he doing?" a pilgrim asked. "He's not supposed to move." Others were moved to tears. "He is grieving," said an older woman in the crowd, her voice trembling. "He loved the Pope." Inside the square, the cardinals shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They exchanged glances with each other, some frowning, others uncertain. A few of them seemed ready to call for action, but no one spoke. The bishops behind them whispered softly, wondering whether this young guard had just caused a scandal. Tradition was strict, and this was no small breach, but no one stepped forward to stop him. Matteo remained still in his kneeling position, his lips moving with quiet words that only those closest to him could hear. His prayer was short, simple, and full of gratitude. To him it was not an act of rebellion, but an act of love. Yet he knew the world did not always see love clearly. His fellow guards kept their eyes straight ahead. Their faces were calm, but Matteo could feel the tension around him. They were trained to ignore distraction, but this was different. One of their own had broken the line. He wondered what they thought of him. Would they feel betrayed, as though he had dishonored them, or would they understand the fire in his heart? The longer Matteo remained kneeling, the stronger the whispers in the crowd grew. The silence began to break into ripples of sound, as people from many nations, speaking many languages, tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Some lifted their phones higher to capture the moment. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. Then, like a spark turning into a flame, something unexpected happened. A few people began to clap. The sound was hesitant at first, a soft ripple against the quiet. Then it grew louder, spreading through the crowd until the applause filled the square. Thousands of hands came together in a rhythm of respect, not for the broken protocol, but for the sincerity of the gesture. The cardinals sat in silence, their eyes sharp, unsure whether to frown or to bow their heads. Some looked troubled, others moved. The bishops behind them seemed torn between two emotions, fear of scandal and awe at the sight. But none of them rose to end it. The choir paused for a brief moment, the voices of the singers faltering as the applause grew louder. Then they continued, their hymn blending strangely with the clapping of the crowd. It was no longer a funeral bound only by rigid rules. It was turning into something more human, something alive. Matteo did not lift his head. He heard the sound of the applause but kept his eyes lowered, his forehead almost touching the handle of his halberd. He had not done this for the crowd. He had not done this for cameras. He had done it for the man he believed had lived a life of true humility. Still, the response of the people filled him with a quiet sense of strength. He was not alone. The Vatican officials standing near the front of the square looked uneasy. Some whispered into radios, unsure if action should be taken, but the sight of the cheering crowd made them hesitate. Pulling the guard away now would only inflame the scene, turning a small breach into a public scandal. For the moment, no one dared move. In homes across the world, people watching live were struck by the image. On television screens, Matteo's face was shown in close detail. His youth, his grief, his devotion. The commentators spoke quickly, some calling it a shocking break from tradition, others calling it a powerful symbol of faith. The image began to spread instantly through social media. The guard who knelt. Inside the square, an elderly cardinal finally lowered his eyes and whispered something softly to the man beside him. No one else heard the words, but his expression had softened. It was as if even he, one of the keepers of tradition, could not entirely deny the truth of the moment. The Pope's coffin lay still at the center of it all, unchanged and silent, but surrounded now by something unexpected. The funeral had begun as a ceremony of rules and rituals, but Matteo's small act had cracked open the walls of formality, letting the raw light of human grief shine through. It was not disrespect, it was love. And the people in the square, the millions watching at home, felt that difference. The applause eventually faded, and the crowd grew quiet again. The choir's hymn rose above the silence, steady and beautiful. The prayers continued, but the memory of the kneeling guard remained heavy in the air. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something that would not be forgotten. Matteo rose slowly from his kneeling position. His movements were calm, deliberate, as though he knew the entire world was watching. He took one step back into line, resuming his place beside his fellow guards. His face remained calm, but inside his heart was steady. He had done what he needed to do. Whatever punishment might follow, he was ready. For a moment, no one moved. The other guards did not shift their eyes toward him, but Matteo thought he saw the faintest change in the air around them, as if they respected his choice even if they could not show it. The cardinals returned their attention to the prayers. The bishops crossed themselves. The crowd settled once again into a reverent silence. Yet the energy of the square was no longer the same. It had been changed by one small act, by one man's courage to show love above rules. Far beyond the Vatican walls, messages began to spread. People posted the image of the kneeling guard, writing words of admiration. Some called him foolish, but far more called him brave. The world was divided in its opinions, but no one was indifferent. The young Swiss guard had turned a page of history without speaking more than a few whispered words. As the funeral continued, the sun broke briefly through the clouds, casting light across the square. For many, it felt like a sign. For Matteo, it was simply a moment of peace. He had carried out his duty, not by the letter of the law, but by the spirit of the man he had served. And as he stood once again like stone, the memory of his kneeling would echo far longer than any rule he had broken. The prayers continued, but the atmosphere inside St. Peter's Square had changed forever. People had come expecting to see tradition followed perfectly, every movement rehearsed, every word planned. Instead, they had witnessed something no one expected, a Swiss guard breaking protocol to kneel before the coffin of Pope Francis. The image lingered in every mind. The crowd, the officials, and even the clergy could not erase it. Matteo Rossi had returned to his place in the line, his face calm once again, but everyone knew the moment had already gone far beyond him. The applause of the crowd had been loud, unstoppable, and deeply emotional. It was not a rejection of tradition, but a recognition of sincerity. Still, inside the Vatican hierarchy, the incident was a storm waiting to break. The cardinals whispered among themselves. Some frowned, their faces tight with disapproval. Others sat quietly, perhaps too stunned to react. To them, this was more than one man kneeling. It was a question of order, of centuries of discipline. The Swiss Guard was the oldest standing army in the world, famous not for numbers but for devotion. For one of them to step out of line was unheard of. Yet the people in the square did not see rebellion. They saw love. Many cried openly, whispering to one another that this was the most powerful moment of the entire funeral. Pilgrims from faraway countries held their rosaries tighter, their tears falling as they watched the young guard stand tall again after kneeling. "This is how a son grieves," one old woman said softly, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is what it means to love a father." Across the world, the reaction was even greater. Television commentators struggled to keep up with the flood of emotion. Some called it shocking, some called it beautiful, and others dared to say it was the truest reflection of Pope Francis's spirit. Social media lit up instantly. Pictures of Matteo kneeling spread across every platform. Words like courage, faith, and devotion filled the screens. Even people who had little interest in the church shared the story, touched by the raw honesty of the gesture. Inside the square, Matteo remained at his post. His face showed nothing, but inside he felt waves of uncertainty. He knew discipline was everything in the guard. He had broken that discipline in front of the entire world. Punishment would almost certainly come, dismissal, maybe even disgrace, yet he felt strangely calm. For him, it had been worth it. He thought again of the Pope's words, "Love is greater than rules." Those words had guided him in the moment, and he did not regret them. The priests leading the prayers carried on as if nothing had happened. Their voices were steady, their rhythm unchanged, but behind them in the seats of power, unease spread. Vatican officials murmured quietly, deciding whether action needed to be taken right away. But there was no easy answer. To punish the young guard in front of the crowd would cause uproar. To ignore the act entirely might set a new example. At that moment, something unexpected began to happen. Slowly, Members of the crowd began folding their hands in prayer, not only because of the funeral, but because they had been inspired by what they had seen. A gesture meant for one man became a ripple spreading outward. Parents bowed their heads with their children. Pilgrims knelt on the cold stone ground. One act of love had awakened thousands more. The cardinals saw it. Some of them, though stern by nature, softened slightly. Even they could not deny that the moment had stirred the faithful. The people were not thinking about broken rules. They were thinking about the Pope's message of compassion, mercy, and humility. And Matteo's act had embodied that message better than any sermon could. As the prayers reached another solemn moment, Matteo kept his eyes fixed forward. He felt the stares of many people upon him, but he did not move again. He had done what his heart demanded, and now he returned to silence. Yet the echo of what he had done continued to live in the square. In homes around the globe, debates began. Was it right for a guard to break protocol? Was it disrespectful, or was it the most respectful act possible? Commentators argued. But the image of Matteo kneeling remained stronger than any words. It became a symbol almost instantly, a picture that spoke of love, devotion, and the courage to follow the heart. Then, in an even more surprising twist, some of the clergy reacted not with anger, but with acceptance. A bishop, known for his closeness to Pope Francis, lowered his head and joined his hands as if in solidarity. Another priest near the coffin knelt briefly as well, though less visibly, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the heart must lead. The crowd responded. Their soft applause grew again, not wild or chaotic, but full of emotion. It rolled through the square like a wave, and this time it seemed almost welcomed. The Vatican, famous for strict order, was allowing the moment to breathe. The applause blended with the hymn, creating a harmony that no one had planned but everyone felt. Matteo's heart beat fast as he heard it. He did not look up, but inside he felt a warmth spread. Perhaps he would still face consequences. Perhaps he would be dismissed. But in that moment he understood something. He had not acted alone. The crowd had joined him. The faithful had joined him. His act was not just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been touched by it. Vatican officials who had been ready to intervene stopped whispering. The atmosphere had shifted too much. To pull Matteo away now would look harsh, even cruel, against the spirit of the moment. For the rest of the ceremony, no one tried to remove him. He remained in his line, a guard once again, but no longer just a guard. And far above, the bells tolled again, their deep tones echoing over the city. For many, it felt as though even the sound of the bells carried a new meaning. The tradition remained, but it had been joined by something fresh, something alive, the honesty of human grief. By the time the coffin was prepared to be carried again, the crowd was still. But every face carried the memory of what had happened. Some people whispered that the Pope himself would have approved, that he had always believed in compassion above rigidity. Others believed it was a sign, a living example of the message he had spent his life preaching. Matteo remained quiet, yet he could not escape the truth. His life had changed in a single moment. Whatever came after, he knew he had done what his heart demanded. He had chosen love over silence. And though the ceremony moved on, the Vatican, the crowd, and the world had been transformed by his choice. When the final hymn ended and the coffin was slowly carried toward its resting place, the crowd watched in silence. The moment of farewell had come. The white coffin, draped with flowers, seemed almost to glow under the gray sky. The bells rang again, their deep voices echoing across Rome, marking the close of an era. Pope Francis was gone, and with him, a chapter of history ended. Yet in the hearts of many, the memory of what they had witnessed that day would never end. The funeral had been filled with tradition, with prayers and rituals as old as time. But what most people would remember was the single act of a young Swiss guard, Matteo Rossi, who broke protocol and knelt before the coffin. That image had burned itself into the minds of millions, carried across the world in moments. Matteo remained at his post until the last part of the ceremony concluded. His body was still, his expression calm, though his heart continued to beat heavily. He had done what his soul demanded, but now he wondered what would come next. He had been trained to expect consequences for any breach of duty. Would his commanders confront him? Would he be punished before the sun even set? He did not know, but he felt no regret. When the square finally began to empty, pilgrims moved slowly, their voices hushed as if they did not want to break the spell of what they had seen. Some carried candles, Others held rosaries close to their hearts. Many of them spoke not of the grandeur of the funeral, but of the guard who knelt. It was the most human moment, a man whispered to his wife. I will never forget it. Inside the Vatican, the discussion began quickly. Officials met in small groups, debating what should be done. Some argued that Matteo had shown disrespect, that discipline could not be broken no matter the reason. Others defended him, saying that his act had touched the faithful and honored the Pope more deeply than any official gesture could. The debate was quiet but intense. For a time, it seemed that Matteo's future hung in the balance. When Matteo finally returned to the barracks of the guard, he was met with silence. His fellow guards did not cheer him, but neither did they scold him. They respected discipline too much to speak openly in that moment. Yet he could sense something in their eyes, perhaps admiration, perhaps concern. None of them had dared to do what he had done, but they all had felt the same grief. Later that evening, he was summoned by his commander. Matteo walked with steady steps, though his heart was heavy. He expected anger, perhaps even dismissal. He thought of his family in Switzerland, of how they might hear of his disgrace in the news. But when he entered the room, the commander's face was not as harsh as he feared. The older man studied him for a long moment before speaking. You broke protocol, the commander said firmly. Yes, sir, Matteo answered, his voice calm. You know the seriousness of that? Yes, sir, and yet you chose to kneel? Matteo hesitated only a moment before replying. Yes, sir. I could not stand as a statue when my heart called me to honor him. I served him in life, and I wished to serve him in death, not only with my duty but with my love. The commander's eyes softened slightly. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then the older man sighed. You may face consequences still. But know this, what you did was seen by the world, and many will remember it not as failure but as devotion. Matteo bowed his head. He did not ask for mercy, nor did he plead for forgiveness. He accepted whatever would come. Outside those walls, the story had already grown. Newspapers printed photographs of him kneeling, calling him the guard who followed his heart. Commentators argued endlessly, but more and more voices praised him. They said his act reflected the true spirit of Pope Francis, a man who had always placed love and compassion above rigid tradition. Days later, when the initial storm of debate had settled, the Vatican made no public statement condemning Matteo, nor did they openly praise him. They chose silence, allowing the moment to speak for itself. It was as if they understood that sometimes an act of the heart is larger than any official word. For Matteo, life returned to a quiet rhythm. He continued to stand guard, continued to wear the ancient uniform, continued to follow orders, yet nothing was quite the same. Wherever he stood, he noticed pilgrims looking at him differently. Some would whisper, others would smile softly as if they knew who he was. Sometimes they tried to thank him quietly as they passed. He never responded, for discipline still guided his actions, but in his heart, he felt their gratitude. Back in his barracks, Matteo kept his memories private. He did not boast, nor did he speak often of what he had done. To him it was never meant to be about glory. It was about a simple farewell, about honoring a man who had changed him. But he could not stop the way the world had taken that moment and made it into something larger. Months later, when people looked back on the funeral of Pope Francis, they spoke of the great hymns, the massive crowd, and the solemn dignity of the day. But above all, they spoke of the guard who knelt. That act became a story told in homes, in churches, and across media. It became a symbol of sincerity in a world often filled with empty rituals. For some, Matteo was a hero. For others, he was simply a man who listened to his heart. But for Matteo himself, he remained only what he had always been, a servant. A servant of faith, a servant of the church, and above all, a servant of love. In quiet moments, when he thought of the Pope, he remembered the gentle words spoken years ago. Serve with love, not fear. And he realized that those words had guided him more than any rulebook ever could. The Vatican may never carve his name into stone, may never list him among the great leaders or saints, but in the hearts of many his act became legend. People would remember the day the world watched a Swiss guard break silence, step forward, and kneel in grief. They would remember the crowd's applause, the tears of strangers, and the way that one small act captured the essence of Pope Francis' life. Matteo did not seek to be remembered, but he could not stop the story from spreading. And in time, he understood that perhaps it was not really his story at all. It was the Pope's story, told through his final farewell. He had simply been the vessel, the one who let his heart speak when words were not enough. Years later, when younger guards asked about the event, some whispered the tale with awe. He was the one who knelt, they would say. And though officials never changed the rules, the story lived on in quiet corners of the barracks. Even among men of discipline, there was respect for the choice of one guard on one extraordinary day. And so, the funeral of Pope Francis became more than a ceremony of tradition. It became a reminder that even in the most rigid of places, love could find a way to speak. And the young guard Matteo Rossi, though only one man among many, became the symbol of that truth. He had broken protocol. But in doing so, he had touched the world.